Who should we be looking for as cuts across the league? And is it really as bad as they say? All of that and more here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, NFL staff writer for A to Z Sports. Want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today on the show, it is Power to the Pod. You guys provided your questions, and we, one day ahead of the Dolphins preseason finale, third preseason game, their only home game this preseason against Jacksonville, are going to tackle the questions that you guys are bringing to the table, courtesy of the Touchdown Miami community, if you will. So the first question comes from Schultze. Are there any specific players who you have your eye on that Miami could have a chance to go after for final cuts? So this would be waiver wire, free agent ad if a player clears cuts. I think the cornerback position in Baltimore is one that I'm watching. I do some Baltimore coverage for A to Z, and they obviously have pretty loaded room where Marlon Humphrey, last year's first-round pick Nate Wiggins, they signed Jair Alexander. Now, they drafted 2 sixth-round guys in this year's draft, and both of them have already landed on IR, but they still have a former mid-round draft choice from last year as well in TJ Tampa. That's 4. They have Chidobe Awuzie. That's 5. They have Jalen Armour Davis. That's 6. And then they have Keon Martin as an undrafted free agent who's a nickel, who's making a big-time push to make this football team. That's 7. Needless to say, I don't think the Ravens are going to carry 7 corners. Now, is it Chidobe Awuzie as the veteran player who is on the equivalent of like the Mike Hilton contract, but he has more outside ability than what Mike Hilton does? So there may be some interest there. Is it Jalen Armour Davis as a former 4th-round draft choice? I think that's the position room for me, that there's a few spots that I think could make some sense. Now, part of this challenge, of course, is the waiver wire and surviving the waiver wire. And that would be part of what Miami is. It would not be guaranteed anything with. In the first month of the season, they're going to be 13th on the waiver wire, right? Because that's where they picked in the NFL draft. But that would be an example of a team in a position. I know we're going to get a little bit later in the show into the tight end position, but as much as you want to sit here and say, hey, maybe you could pick up a tight end, I think your pathway to a tight end ad is pretty narrow, in part because of what this offense asks the tight ends to do, and not just block and receive, but the motions and that utilization. It's a lot. And I think that's part of been the blockade for getting the tight end position to a certain point with the do-it-all player has been, what's more important to you? The dynamic ability to shift your formational strength based on shifts and motions and guys that line up in the slot, but line up in line, but line up in the backfield and line up in an H-back alignment and are comfortable with that and the broad menu that provides? Or do you want a guy that's going to run routes and create separation and so on and so forth? Like, they're two very different things. And for me, as I assess what the Dolphins do and do not have, that's where I'm just skeptical that they're going to pull somebody off the street at the end of August and say, hey, come in here and do all this stuff. I just think it's too broad of a menu that's going to require too much time to get an upgrade for the Pharaoh Brown / Julian Hill piece of the roster, personally. So cornerback, where things are a little bit more simple and it's more about communication and understanding coverage assignments, if you've got vets that have that, would maybe be where I think you can find some headway on waiver claims. Charles wants to know if there's an update on Devon Achane. I do not have an update on Devon Achane. It's been made to sound as though this is not a super severe issue. But calves are scary because calves and the trickle-down effect from calf strains into the Achilles and the potential ramifications of that are no joke. One thing I know about the Dolphins with how they've handled injuries, for better or for worse, from a soft tissue perspective, you feel pretty good that they're not going to put Achane out there with an elevated risk of re-injury. So of a more severe injury. Like they have shown over the Mike McDaniel era, they're going to be very methodical to take your time to get back onto the field, especially with a player who has a soft tissue that could become a season-ending major issue. I think the irony here is some of the injury spotlight that the Dolphins have had with players like Jalen Phillips is Phillips recovered from the Achilles and then had friendly fire and down he went. And it's not really controllable to have another major injury like that when your teammate comes careening into your knee. So I don't have a firm update on Devon Achane other than it was made to sound like a mild calf that would take a couple of weeks to cool down, and we'll see Devon Achane from there. Finn's OG, are there any positions we might trade someone out of, even if it's a player swap or a late rounder? I think you're much more likely to see player swaps at this stage for the Dolphins. I think that obviously inspired by the Minkah Fitzpatrick, Jalen Ramsey, Jonnu Smith saga. Now, yeah, you got a 5 out of that, but at the same time, it was, from a finances perspective, it was almost a 1-for-1 break even once you paid a little bit more on Ramsey's contract for Minkah for Jalen Ramsey. Now, are there some position rooms where you have some log jams and maybe have somebody that could be of an appeal? Yeah. I think your defensive, whoever is your odd man out at defensive tackle, not great trade value, but maybe you could flip in a player for player swap for somebody else. I think the Ethan Bonner injury kind of throws some cold water on the Cam Smith potential end of his tenure. I would imagine Cam Smith will probably get kept as a result of Bonner presumably missing an extended portion of the early part of the season with the hamstring that he has. It did not sound like it was a small strain for Ethan Bonner. I think wide receiver, where you have 6 and you have the numbers game elsewhere, you could potentially justify trading a D. Eskridge potentially, or there's a bunch of teams that are looking for wide receivers. Is Eskridge that far in front of Taj Washington with the other guys that you have that can do special teams value? I don't have the answer, but like those would be the kinds of names. Quentin Bell potentially on the edge, just because now with the add of Matthew Judon, you're kind of looking at that subsection of Quentin Bell and Cam Good and Mohamed Kamara. Did somebody really like Kamara, and would they want to do a player for player swap or a late round pick swap to bring him in and take a shot? Like, probably not. But I think Bell, with what he showcased last year, there's teams that Quentin Bell would probably be the third best edge on. And he's at best the 5th, if not the 6th edge in Miami now. With the 4 guys, the 4 proven sack artists in front of him, and probably battling for Cam Good for the 5th spot and the final roster spot, in my mind. That's how I break it down, is I have the Dolphins keeping 5 on the edge. Those would be the spots for me. We have more takes, more questions, more power to the pod submissions. We're going to get into it all next here, Locked on Dolphins. Make sure you guys stick with us. Today's episode of Locked on Dolphins is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. It is the best time of year. NFL kickoff is almost here, and that means fantasy football season is back in full swing. This year, Yahoo Fantasy is turning things up with a fantasy football experience unlike ever before. Locked On Dolphins this year is playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making your millionth league. To celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 new features over 28 days across the month of August. To kick it off, they dropped Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, killer new way to play Yahoo Fantasy Football, where the lowest scoring team each week is eliminated until there's just one team left standing. With the season around the corner, now is the time to get your league together and give this new league mode a try. If you're more into the classics, you could still play in head-to-head private leagues or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. Continuing onward here on Power to the Pod. Pete wants to know what scheme changes that have shown themselves through this preseason can we expect to translate to the season? Reports of more press coverage, running game improvements, etc. So I think you have three. I have three that come to mind for me. The first being, Pete, what you first mentioned, the physical coverage on the outside. It certainly feels like, and you heard Jack Jones talk about how he fancies himself as more of an off corner. They're trying to get him with more press technique. Anthony Weaver talking about wanting to be physical inside the contact window and disrupting the timing of opposing offenses so that they can allow their pass rush to get home or to force bad decisions or force inaccurate throws. It certainly feels like to me, whether it's cover two or press man, they are aspiring to play more of that and then allow the athletes in the middle of the field to dictate more of the spacing and covering and distributing the routes that break into the middle of the field. It certainly feels like the intent is we want you to not get clean releases so that we can hunt with the group of pass rushers that we have. And then if you're going to run stuff that's timing stuff, we're going to force you to throw earlier than you want, and your receivers are not going to be where they're supposed to be. A lot of the critiques that exist around the Dolphins offense for when teams are having success getting after them is that's the kind of thing that you get the sense that the Dolphins are going to try to do with this year's unit. And that's why they're maybe a little bit more keen to trust the young guys that they have. I think the running game improvements, I saw a lot that I like from Nick Westbrook-Akine in the first preseason game against Chicago. Sounds like we're going to get the starters again on Saturday, so I'll be watching for that. That's a big role because I haven't necessarily seen the Pharaoh Brown assimilation in the way that maybe I was hoping that we would. They're trying to get him comfortable with a lot of the motion stuff, and it just doesn't feel natural. It feels he's a little bit more rigid than what Julian Hill is. So I think that maybe puts you in a position where Pharaoh can be the true inline player, but your move player still, I think your best move player that you have at the tight end position to block is still Julian Hill. And he has a lot of success in that regard, but it's very inconsistent, and that's what creates the frustrating reps that people dog Julian Hill for. And then I think the other one is the Bobby Slowick infusion in the passing game. I've liked a lot of what I've seen from some of the non-play action passing concepts where it's you had some plays last year where I thought the spacing was kind of frustrating. The amount of eligibles that you're sending out into routes, where they are on the field, relation to one another, the stress that you put on opposing defenses. I just thought as they tried to work around their limitations last year, they got kind of inefficient at times. It felt like to me with where their eligibles were at. You know, remember that balloon swing where you got the lead blocker with the the swing route in the backfield. So you're taking two players to run one route. It's a basic example of it. But that, to me, getting away from that and using your 5 to sprace the full width of the field and leaning into what you're anticipating is continued growth from Tua Tagovailoa from a pre-snap processing perspective to get his eyes in the right place and work the right area of the field and find completions. And lean more into his willingness to take the easy checkdowns and keep the offense on schedule when the primary is not available. I think those are the three big picture offensive and defensive scheme changes that I'm expecting. Eli, if everything goes according to plan, barring any injuries, what big picture modifications do you expect in the defensive playbook? I think, and we just talked about the press coverage, I don't think we can undersell or oversell, I should say, the way that the spine of this defense is better. And I know a couple different places, and forgive me for not having it off the top of my head, have cited this statistic of the Dolphins were number one in the league in yards allowed before contact running the ball. But they missed a lot of tackles. So they're getting to the ball schematically and structurally very quickly. They're not conceding a lot, but then they're not making the plays and finishing. So upgrading the defensive tackles, more speed at linebacker, and not only more speed at linebacker, but like better linebackers. Your fourth linebacker this year is better than your third linebacker last year. And Jordan Brooks is Jordan Brooks. Tyrell Dotson is a year in the system. Just half of it was spent in Seattle and now half of it in Miami last year. Willie Gay's been electric throughout camp. KJ Britt is a plug player who's got starting experience. You can watch Willie Gay and KJ Britt fit in the run on the back end, and those two guys, they look like starters. There's some linebacker rooms where I think those two guys would be your starting stack off all linebackers, and they're both backups. Now, I don't think the Dolphins have great depth everywhere, but I think they've got great depth at linebacker. And then the safeties, where Minka coming in versus relative to Javon Holland and Jordan Poyer, I think you've got a more diverse collection of skill sets, and then you have kind of the proven player in Minka, regardless of where the ceiling still is for him relative to his prime, as a do-it-all type of player versus like we thought Javon Holland was going to be a do-it-all player. We thought Javon Holland was going to be that marquee talent. He hadn't been that in 2 years. So I think that trickle-down effect for both run defense and pass defense is going to be the biggest thing defensively for me that's going to be different and feel different. We have more submissions here on Power to the Pod. That is next. Make sure you guys stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by BetterHelp. These days, it feels like there's a little bit of advice for everything. Cold plunges, gratitude journals, screen detoxes, you name it. But how do you know what actually is right for you? So much information online about mental health and wellness, it can be overwhelming to figure out what's true and what will actually help. So we're talking to a licensed therapist through BetterHelp can make all the difference. You get real personalized guidance instead of just guessing based on something you saw on your algorithm. With over 30,000 therapists, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, serving more than 5 million people. It's easy to fit in your schedule. Just click to connect, and you could switch therapists at any time you need. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off the first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Got a few more to bring us home here. Schultze wants to know, what's your go-to sandwich order at a Sammy shop? Whether this is Publix or elsewhere. I like the chicken tender stuff. Teriyaki chicken. Something that I like. I'll get the long sandwich, and then I'll take the other half of the sandwich and put the meat into it, and then get rid of the other half of bread. I'm a big bread guy by nature, but I can't bring myself to eat whether they're shortchanging and it's actually 11 inches or 12 inches of sub sandwich bread. I get lethargic at that point. Harvard FinFan. Is this team really as bad as the national media is making them out to be? They got to be better than a 5-7 win team. Of course, if Tua goes down, all bets are off. You said it, not me. If Tua goes down, all bets are off. And maybe everybody in the national media is banking that Tua Tagovailoa goes down again and misses time. I just think about the extent of which things went wrong last year. And I understand the strength of schedule last year was not superimposing. I get it. I understand. They did beat the Rams on the road in primetime last year. And that team took the Eagles to the brink on the road in the snow in Philadelphia in the NFC divisional round. It was a good football team last year. And they were getting their offensive line back. Healthy. But you had the Tyreek snafu. You had the contract holdouts. You had, and this is just some of it. This isn't all of it. You had the Tua concussion in week 2 and the subsequent 4-week IR stint where he missed 4 games. Tua comes back. Zach Sealer, Javon Holland, Kader Kohu are down. The week Tua comes back. Like you can go across the roster from top to bottom and go week by week. The Dolphins didn't have a normal week leading up to the start of a game until the Rams game, because Sealer was out for the Bills game for a orbital bone injury suffered in practice. So you had all this stuff that goes wrong and distractions and what we've heard about what was going on behind the scenes. You didn't have Bradley Chubb at all. You had Jalen Phillips for 3.5 games. You had rookie Chop Robinson. Emmanuel Ogbah, Tyus Bowser, and Quentin Bell are your other edge options at that stage. Now, Calais Campbell was a hit for sure. I think Johnny Smith was a hit for sure. But you had, in just about every phase, it was chaos last year. And you won 8 games. And I look at the schedule this year, and I know Strons had a follow-up to this submission and said, I read articles that had us losing to the Browns, the Colts, the Falcons, the Panthers, trying to figure out if they're talking about the same team that I'm talking about. All bets are off if Tua gets hurt. But I look at what the Dolphins have, and I ask myself the question, do they have enough with some good fortunes in player availability with the schedule that they have to win 10 games this year? And my answer is yes. Now, for every game that Tua misses, I think you have to project them to take 3/4 of one loss. So if he misses 4 games, you're talking about 3 losses, right? So you'd be 1-3 in the 4 games that he misses. Now, maybe Zach Wilson or Quinn Ewers changes that. But that's how I view it, is if we get 17 games, I'm probably looking at 9 or 10 wins would be how I forecast this team. A lot of this is going to be dictated on the young players. I just wrote this today for A to Z Sports. They've got potentially 30% of the 53-man roster is rookies from last year and this year combined. What's your player development look like for those guys? What's your player development for Patrick Paul, Malik Washington, Jason Marshall moving to the nickel, Kenneth Grant, Jordan Phillips, Chop Robinson, Dante Trader, potentially, Taj Washington, Storm Duck. What's the growth of those guys? That's going to determine a lot for me for this team. But no, I don't look at the conversation of the Dolphins being the biggest train wreck in football or being the worst team in football, and that's what they're destined for. I don't buy that, personally. I don't. Now, if Tua goes down week 1 and misses whatever amount of time, and I'm knocking on wood, and I hate that we have to acknowledge the conversation, but the body of work is the body of work, right? until you continue to do it with consistency, it's going to be something that people say, yeah, but about. With good injury fortunes, this is not a 5-win team. It's not. I think they've got one of the best edge rooms in football now with Matthew Judon and the guys that they have. To go with a really promising nucleus on the defensive tackle room with Zach Sealer leading the charge on that front. I just got done saying it's one of the better linebacker rooms in football. They've got outstanding depth at linebacker. They do have some needle-moving talent offensively. I think Jonas Savaiinaia, the health of Austin Jackson, the health of Devon Achane, like obviously the health of the quarterback. They're a more high variance team than a lot of teams across the league. And I think there are outcomes in which they win 5 games. But I don't think that's the baseline threshold that so many people are I think, making the assumption on. Same old Dolphins. Why has the team not made a splash trade on a corner despite how weak the room is? Are they really going to go all in on a number 1 front 7 like it seems to be right now? I know they are showing interest in corners. And at some point it becomes what or get off the pot time. I think it's a shame because I do think Jack Jones is going to have more good than bad with his contributions. Jason Marshall / Mike Hilton, you've got an upside developmental and a high floor player in the nickel. They really like Storm Duck. If Kader Kohu hadn't gone down, I probably would say this has the potential to be a league average room. Without him, we need to see him play. But I don't think they're there yet, but I think they have a number of assets that they want to see through, and they don't want to cut some of those assets off unless it's at the right price. Now, they could very easily get 3 weeks into the season and one of these guys fails miserably with the first 3 games, in which case there's going to be some panic, and I would expect the appetite to ratchet it up, would go up. John, cut, trade, and bench, burgers, wings, and pizza. Man, I am cutting burgers. I am benching pizza, and I'm trading 4 wings. I hope that's the intent that you had for the trade element of that, but I want the wings. John also asked, why does coach expect such high bars from our tight ends in the blocking game? The inherent value, and it's the same reason why that you like a fullback in this offense. The inherent value that exists is that you can change the formational strength, and it's the tool. They're perceived as the tool that gives the information to the offense. They're the tool that gives the information to the quarterback, where they often shift, they often motion, they change the strength, they can change the passing strength, they can simultaneously change the run strength, but then you can also change it after the snap with what those guys do and their relation to the core. They're an extension of both the run and the pass game together. And the way that Mike tries to get it to work is the X factor to chase and pursue multiplicity within your offense. But I think to do that, it's hard to do that the way that San Francisco with Shanahan did it. They did that with big receivers. Miami's not doing that with big receivers. Now they're building out a little bit more of a diverse room this year, and I think that will help. But now the pressure goes on the coaches to get the right combination of skill sets on the field at the right time as compared to Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, right? Those are both big physical guys. And then the pressure for them to contribute in the run game versus guys like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and their contributions in that regard, or River or Braxton or whoever else, right? Our last question comes from Ran. kind of improvements are you looking for from Tua? Obviously, aside of taking care of himself and his controllables. Uh, really want to see Tua continue to have the answers before the ball is snapped. I think we've kind of reached that stage of like his maturation. Where that's a measure and threshold of success for me. The greats, the really good ones, the really effective ones. If you don't want to use the word great because you don't like his skill set, whatever. The really effective quarterbacks in the NFL, they get to a certain point and they can get up to the line of scrimmage and they understand what you're playing and they know where the answers are at within the confines of your play and what's being called. And they know what they need to do before the ball is snapped. And that's where you can continue to level up the efficiency of the offense to walk the rope between getting the ball to the check down and getting the ball out of your hands and protecting yourself, but bringing more explosive plays back into the offense, having your eyes in the right place, understanding when you're hot, understanding where pressure's coming from, understanding where your problems are, understanding when you have mismatches, understanding when to alert to a guy on a one-on-one matchup, understanding when to work a progression, where your progression needs to start, all of that. And that's really hard to quantify on film because you don't have a lot of that information on if X, then Y, if A, then B. But I think that's the stage that we're at because, like, I think the physical elements are what they are. So your improvements have to be in the other phases. And that's where I go back to the conversation that I had with Kurt Warner last summer about Tua and his growth. That's going to do it for us here today on the show. Hope you guys enjoyed today's episode of Power to the Pod. You can keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I'll be back with you all tomorrow after the preseason game for a post-game showcase. We also have Greece with the postcast, so do not be surprised. Greece is going to do the postcast on a live stream on YouTube. It'll be in the podcast feed. I will have my own post-game show as well that you can keep your eyes peeled for. Fins up, keep it locked in right here, Locked On Dolphins. I'll talk to you all again soon.